Namaste and welcome to the AIDIA Dialogue. South Asia is the fastest growing economy in the world. But latest report from the World Bank reveals that in order to sustain high growth rate and reach its full economic potential, increasing its export is absolutely necessary. In this episode of AIDIA Dialogue, I am going to discuss with Mr. Hans Thapa, Chief Economist of World Bank South Asia region, focusing on the economic outlook of the South Asia, primarily of Nepal. Hans, welcome to AIDIA Dialogue.
Thanks for having me.
We're very delighted to welcome you as our guest.
Thank you, Sama.
And I would like to begin with the latest edition of World Bank's South Asia Economic Focus, which provides great insight to the region's economic status while focusing on export to drive growth. Can you tell us more about that report, the key highlights from that report?
That report confirms that South Asia as a region continues to be the fastest growing region in the world. Growing faster than China, growing faster than East Asia. That's largely due to India and to Bangladesh, but the last 2 years also because of fast growth in Nepal. So that's very good news. It shows that increasingly the economic center in the world is shifting towards Asia, not just to China, but to the whole of Asia. So that's one observation. But when we look underneath the growth rates in South Asia, we are a bit more concerned. What we are seeing, especially the last 2 years, is that growth is increasingly driven by domestic demand. And that shows in widening current account deficits. It shows in larger and larger fiscal deficits. The spending goes faster than the production. And so that, from the short-run perspective, that is a problem because this happens in an environment where increasingly international financing of current account deficits is becoming more difficult. So that put pressure on reserves, it put pressure on currencies. That is of a concern. But if you ask me personally, I'm even more concerned about what that means in the very long run. Because a country needs exports, needs to integrate into global markets to continue to grow. And the whole region is underperforming in exports. And so that's the final observation. What we did in the report, we looked at all countries in the world using a model to explain what exports should be given the level of development, given the size of a country. And then we see that South Asian countries are only exporting 1/3 of what they are supposed to export. And if you look at Nepal, it's only 1/9. Export should be 9 times as much. And so that is really a concern for the long run. That has to change, otherwise the high growth rates are not sustainable.
Yeah, trade deficit is something that everyone here in Nepal is worried about. A lot of policy reform, institutional reform has been undertaken, but things are not moving. We'll talk about that trade deficit later as well. In your analysis, where does Nepal stand compared to its South Asian neighbors? Can you be more specific regarding Nepal?
So the growth rates have been quite high, around 7%. That's very similar to India and Bangladesh. But in terms of level of income, it is still lagging behind. It is, as I said, underperforming in exports to a higher degree than the other countries. And also other aspects of openness, integration into the world. It is lagging. For example, foreign direct investment into the country, that is very, very small. It's around 0.2% of GDP. Similar countries at the same level of development that are very successful, they have typically more like 3, 4, perhaps even 5% of GDP of capital coming in. So it is still a very closed economy.
What is your analysis, what are the major factors restraining South Asian regional economic integration? A lot of time we hear that South Asia is the fastest growing economy, but one of the least integrated regions, which comprises about 5% intra-regional trade, far below the potential, I guess.
Yeah, so it's underperforming in the regional trade, but not only in the regional trade. South Asia is actually underperforming in every single market in the world. They should export more to Asia, they should export more to the United States. The only exception is Bangladesh, that is exporting more to Europe than they're supposed to do. But in all other cases, it's underperforming. What are the reasons? One is trade policies. If you have high import tariffs, which many countries have, then not only you are discouraging imports, but actually you are discouraging exports also. That is partly because you use imports for exports, but also when you discourage imports, you make domestic production more expensive. And so always the exports are following the imports. So trade policies is one reason. Lack of mobility in the domestic economy, that is another reason. If a lot of the resources and the high quality people are working in larger companies that are focused on the non-tradables, and it's difficult to get them out, then it's difficult to grow your export sector.
MSMEs are ignored or undermined?
Yes, I think that the micro and small and medium-sized enterprises should play a key role in reversing this trend. I don't think you can expect from the large economies that they are the driver of new export flows. Those are often often companies that are working in the domestic non-tradable sector. Like many other countries, Nepal also has a history of what we call elite capture, that you have big companies that have been very comfortable because they have been protected and shielded from fierce competition. So you can't expect from those companies suddenly to become very competitive. What you can expect is that new companies are coming, whether that's in agriculture or in high tech, kids coming from universities that can start compete. But for that, you need an environment that supports those small companies.
And talking about trade deficit, as per the latest report, Nepal's trade deficit jumped up to 22% in the last 9 months of this fiscal year, with import crossing 1 trillion compared to export. That's just about 70 billion rupees. What are your recommendations for Nepal to help unleash its export potential? A lot of time we hear that we have a tremendous export potential, but that is not used in optimum capacity. What are your recommendations?
The first recommendation is to make it top priority, to focus on the exports, to do everything what inhibits the exports. It's often not a single policy change that can achieve it. It's to listen a lot to the companies who have ideas for exporting and ask them why they don't succeed, and take away those problems. As I said, it is important to reduce import tariffs. It is important to make the domestic labor market more flexible, and it is important to create a level playing field where banks are not just lending to the old larger companies, but actually start looking for those new companies that have the new ideas that could compete in international markets.
And you think we need a strong policy reform in this sector?
Yeah, I think it's not just a policy reform, it is a strong commitment.
And talking about the geopolitical situation, Nepal is a landlocked country between two of Asia's strong economies, China and India, and obviously there must be numerous opportunities that Nepal can gain from. Gathering from your expertise in this region, can you share some of the ideas, or where does opportunity lie for us here in Nepal?
No, as you said, it's a great opportunity, and it would be wonderful if Nepal could integrate into both economies, because both economies have huge potential, large markets where you can benefit, but probably even more important, those are countries where there's a lot of competitive pressure, and that means that you can learn from that competitive pressure that pushes up the productivity. That is true for India, it is true for China also. Those are countries where there's a lot of knowledge. You can bring back knowledge when you compete in those countries, and I think it is important that you diversify, that you're not only dependent on one country. There are many examples in the world where you have smaller countries that have a big country as a neighbor, can benefit a lot from that. Think about Tajikistan and Russia, also Armenia and Georgia and Russia. They have benefited a lot, but they are also vulnerable because they are close only to one economy. The same is Poland integrating into the German industry. They benefited a lot from that, but now they are a little bit uncomfortable that they might be too integrated just in the German industry. So if you have the opportunity, and there's not many countries that have two big neighbors, to integrate in both countries, that would be wonderful.
But a lot of time we feel and we see that it is bringing a lot of dependency to this giant neighbor, and governments should work very cleanly. There's a very fine line where we can pave our own path. What is your specific recommendation so that we won't be falling in the trap of big economy?
I wouldn't call it a trap, because there's so many opportunities to be integrated, and it's much better than being isolated as a small country that is landlocked. But I think the main direction is, however difficult it might be because of geopolitical tensions, to be open to both big economies and to try to integrate into both economies. That is a great potential.
And we just talk about the role of MSMEs, how they can contribute to national economy. While it's often, I feel that large industries are given very much priority than the MSMEs. How here government can work closely with MSMEs so that they can contribute in national economy? Do you think enough care or attention are given to MSMEs in a country like Nepal? What is the real problem?
No, I think there can be more focus on those new smaller companies. And I think two things are important, and ultimately this is about very practical implementations. There has to be a lot of transparency, why policies are implemented in the way they are implemented, and not only looking at what the attitude is towards those new small companies, but also looking at what the attitude is towards the existing larger companies, and are the implementations too much tilted towards protecting those companies, and is it enough a level playing field? In practice, where the small companies have the biggest problem is getting finance, it is reducing the burden of all kinds of administrative regulations, and it is getting direct access to international markets. And the government has to listen to those small companies to see what the problems are, and be committed to solve those problems.
And I'd also like to draw your attention to the next subject, that is Nepal aims to graduate to a developing country by 2022 and also middle income status by 2030. In this context, what do you think are some primary investment in human capital development that the government will need to take care of? Your analysis on that?
Yeah, for continued high growth, investing in people, investing in their education, investing in their health is a top priority. That is ultimately the main driver of economic growth in a country. From the very long-term point of view, a focus on the youngest kids is very important because nutrition of the smallest kids is incredibly essential. In the first 3 years the brain is developing, and when you have undernutrition or malnutrition, then the brain is not fully developing. There's still a lot of stunting in Nepal, and that limits their capacity for the rest of their life. So that is an important focus. Early childhood education is also important. The second one is the quality of education. There is a big diversity in the quality of education. What we show in our research is that the kids up to 18 years old, they get almost 12 years of education. So that is quite good. That's on average. But then if you look at what the quality adjusted number of education years is that the children in Nepal are getting, that's only 7 years. So you're losing 5 years just because the quality of education is not good enough. And so you have to improve the quality, and that means basically you have to create a more equal environment where all the kids are getting access to the same quality education.
Recently, Nepal had just come out with its budget for the fiscal year. The plans and programs are always very ambitious, but implementation and disbursement of funds are always challenging. How can budget spending be better and more effective? Your remarks on this?
In my view, what is very important, and perhaps it has been done, but is to seriously evaluate what the causes were of that past underspending, and so to address those causes. And so it could be that ultimately the urgency was not there, that there were other priorities that came in. There are many other problems like the fiscal federalism. There might have been other problems. So it's good to know that why certain projects didn't get the attention that they needed. So that could be one problem. Another problem could be that there is just not the capacity in the government to efficiently implement those projects. A third problem could be, and I've seen that in other countries also, that the companies that are ultimately building the infrastructure or working on those projects don't have the capacity, or perhaps they get advance payments and then they go to the next project because they want to collect even more without finishing it on time. So it's very important to know what the causes are. If it is, for example, the latter, then you can change the contracts that these companies are paying fines.
So strong
if
regulation
they are,
and monitoring
strong,
can work.
Regulation and monitoring, and ultimately incentives also, that they pay fines if they don't complete it.
And you must be aware, Nepal is just easing into a newly federated structure. One centralized system is branching into 7 provinces and 700 local government. That is also a very remarkable sign for all of us. What are the challenges you see with the federalization and the opportunities also lying ahead for us?
So let me start first with the opportunities. I think there are lots of opportunities. First of all, politically, it is a very good development. Because it creates more stability. More people will feel involved in the government with a federalism and more autonomy at the local level. Also, from an economic point of view, it can increase efficiency in the sense that at a lower level, the suppliers of the services, they understand better the needs of the customers. It can be more efficient. And the people, they are willing to give feedback to the providers of the services. They feel more committed to pay the taxes and the fees. So from an economic point of view, it can be very efficient. And very important is that creates an opportunity to experiment and to have some competition. If everything is centralized, then all the changes are at once and everybody has to do the same. And then it might be right, but it might be wrong also. If you have all these local governments that are going their own way, then you have a lot of experiments where others can learn from. Ultimately, what is important is not just the federalism and the decentralization, but that you have a good coordination between the high level and the low level, because you still have to make sure that there is some kind of oversight. For example, when we talk about education, that at a national level there is a test of quality, that you make sure that that quality is more or less equal everywhere. There has to be a mechanism where you correct large inequalities that might appear, and you need to ensure that you don't have completely autonomous entities where perhaps the capacity is not there, where perhaps corruption is emerging, but that you have a situation where you really have competition. So there are big challenges. There are challenges in terms of the capacity at the lower level, but ultimately this is a great development and a huge opportunity.
Critics of the World Bank are concerned about the conditionalities attached to their lending, and they argue that the recipient countries are compelled to implement certain economic reform and forced to keep aside their sovereign right. How do you want to respond to this?
That was a criticism, let me think, during the 1990s, when we really had conditionality in our lending.
But still there are conditionalities.
And we try to learn from that. And so we changed that system in the sense that we reward countries for what they have done already. We call that the prior actions. We are completely aware that we are not the ones that are deciding on what kind of policies a country should pursue. But if a country has a plan, if country has developed certain policies, and we think that is something that has great potential, then we come in and we say we can support you in pursuing that goal, and then the lending starts also. But if a country goes in another direction, we are not saying no, we are not going to support you because we think you should go in that direction. Then again, we are looking at what is happening and whether that makes sense for the priorities in that country and for the circumstances. And when we agree and we say, yes, let's work together.
A lot of people are also sensitive regarding the neutrality approach of World Bank, along with the emergence of AIB, EXIM and all. Do you think the geopolitical tussle will influence an organization like World Bank?
We try to work with all countries in the world, and we do that, whether it is democracies or whether it is different kind of countries. We try to work in every single country. It's very difficult to be completely outside of the tensions of the geopolitical developments, but I think when you compare an organization like the World Bank with many other issues in the global economy, I think you would conclude that as much as possible we are indeed apolitical and we work with as many countries as possible.
Over the time, what are the major changes that took place in applied economic condition in financing from World Bank?
One important change is that we have become smaller relative to all the financing in the world. In the past, especially in African countries and in poorer countries, we were the only game in town, and we had a lot of influence. Increasingly, these countries, they have access to markets, they have access to other sources of finance, with China becoming an important source of finance at the moment also. So a big shift in the World Bank is that the focus is not just on the amount of financing that we give, but that we more try to bring different partners together that we try to create markets, that we leverage our own capital, that we try to bring in private capital also. And so increasingly, in our view, that means that we are less of a bank just providing money, and increasingly a knowledge organization that works with countries to come with the best solutions possible.
Also, there are growing concern that the organization like World Bank serves to the country which are heavily industrialized, developed, and often undermines country like Nepal while implementing any policy or jotting down any policy. Do you feel that happening?
No, not at all. First of all, I see that the relationship between the World Bank and Nepal, not just the government but the whole society, is very good, is very lively. We have a very active program in Nepal, and increasingly we are active in many different sectors, and the focus on human capital, and we will have a whole conference this week in Kathmandu on that, shows that we are focusing on issues that are very important for countries that perhaps don't have the big industry yet that can be supported, but it still has many areas where we can work together.
And what is your personal observation regarding the work carried out by World Bank here in Nepal? Are you happy with the outcome?
Yes, I'm very happy with the dialogue. I'm very happy with the direction the country is going in. I see a lot of problems. I see problems of changing the past. That was very difficult. I see problems in implementation, and we experience that ourselves also. Some of the projects are lagging in the implementation. So that is only good, because that means that there is a lot of work to be done. In general, I'm very encouraged by the kind of interaction that we have and by the richness of the program that we have in Nepal.
And also, a lot of people are worried about the environmental hazards going around while implementing big projects or developing infrastructure. Is the World Bank serious enough for the all socio-economic problem and the environmental problem?
Yeah, I think it's one of our top priorities. We try to calculate which part of our lending is related to environmental issues, and especially we try to calculate how much is going to adapting to climate change or mitigating climate change. And in the World Bank, South Asia is leading there. 1/3 of our activities in South Asia can be seen as related to mitigating or adapting to climate change, and that's just one example. I strongly believe that sustained long-term economic growth is only possible if you have a sustainable environment. And Nepal is very vulnerable, vulnerable to climate change, vulnerable to earthquakes. There's always the danger of air quality in South Asia. That should be a top priority, because if you don't solve those problems, you will not be successful in economic growth also.
Thank you, Hans. Thank you for your insight, thoughts. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.